The air inside the old community hall was thick and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was that kind of damp chill that settles into your bones during late autumn.
Oh, the kind that makes you want to stay home under a blanket.
But the hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled every available space, creaking occasionally as people shifted their weight. The low hum of whispered conversations buzzed through the room, mixing with the sound of rain tapping gently against the high, arched windows. Near the back of the room, a woman sat very still. Her name was Alina, but in this crowd, she was just another face in the crowd. She wasn't here to perform. She was here because her husband David had brought her. He thought it would be good for her to get out of the house, to see people, to hear music again. He meant well, but Alina felt like she didn't belong. She felt like a ghost walking among the living. She gripped the edges of the flimsy paper program in her lap, crinkling it slightly. Her knuckles were white. She stared at the bold black letters on the page, but she wasn't reading them. She was just trying to focus on something other than the tightness in her chest. It had been 10 years. 10 long years since she had last touched a piano. In that time, she had built a wall around herself, brick by invisible brick. To the people who knew her, the neighbors, the co-workers, the casual acquaintances, Alina was the picture of stability. She was the woman who always paid her bills on time, who kept a tidy garden, who smiled politely when spoken to. She was the woman who had managed to keep it together when tragedy struck. They admired her strength. They told her how brave she was. But David knew the truth. He sat next to her, glancing sideways every few minutes. He saw the way her shoulders were permanently hunched forward, as if she were carrying a heavy stone on her back. He saw the dullness in her eyes, like a candle that was burning out. He knew that her strength was really just silence. She wasn't brave because she wanted to be. She was silent because she didn't know how to make a sound anymore. The pain she carried was too big for words, so she just stopped speaking. She stopped doing the things she loved. And most of all, she stopped playing the piano. The piano on stage sat silent and imposing. It was a grand piano, black and shiny, reflecting the stage lights. It looked beautiful, but to Alina, it looked like a mouth waiting to open. It reminded her of the days before the silence, back when her mother was alive. Her mother had been the one who taught her to play. They had spent hours in their living room, Elena's small hands struggling to reach the octaves while her mother guided her fingers. Music had been the language they spoke. It was how they laughed, how they argued, and how they made up. But then the sickness came. The long, slow decline of her mother's health had turned the music into something else. It became the soundtrack to pain. Alina remembered sitting at the piano in the hospital room, playing soft, gentle tunes, trying to drown out the beeping of the machines. She played until her fingers ached, hoping the music would reach her mother, hoping it would somehow fix things. It didn't. When her mother passed away, the piano stopped being a friend. It became a tombstone. Every time Alina looked at a keyboard, she didn't see music. She saw grief. She saw the empty chair where her mother used to sit. So, she closed the lid. She walked away. She promised herself she would never play again. Now, sitting in the back of the hall, Alina felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She regretted coming. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in. She leaned over to David. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. David looked at her, his face soft and full of understanding. He reached over and covered her hand with his. "Just stay for a little while," he whispered back. "Listen to the first piece. If you still want to go after that, we'll leave." Alina bit her lip. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She just nodded and looked back at the stage. The event was a charity recital to raise money for the local children's hospital. It was a good cause, and the performers were all local volunteers. The program listed 4 different acts. Suddenly, a man in a suit walked onto the stage. He was the organizer for the evening. He tapped the microphone lightly, causing a screech of feedback that made everyone wince. The murmuring died down as he prepared to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the hall, "thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We have a wonderful program prepared for you. However, I have a bit of an announcement." The crowd waited. Alina didn't care about announcements. She just wanted the night to be over. Our featured pianist for the evening. Mr. Thomas, the man continued, looking down at a piece of paper in his hand, has unfortunately had a family emergency and will not be able to perform. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. People looked at each other, surprised and a little disappointed. I know this is a disappointment, the organizer said, holding up a hand to calm the room. We are trying to find a replacement, but it is short notice. If there is anyone in the audience who plays and would like to fill in, we would be incredibly grateful. A silence fell over the room. It wasn't just quiet. It was that specific kind of awkward silence where nobody wants to make eye contact. People looked down at their shoes or up at the ceiling. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. The organizer cleared his throat, looking nervous. Anyone? We have the sheet music right here on the stand. Just some classical standards. Lena stared at the floor. She felt a sudden, intense wave of panic. She knew she could play. She knew the pieces sitting on that music rack: Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven. She had played them all 1,000 times in another life. But she also knew that opening that door would be dangerous. If she played, the wall she had built might crumble. David's hand squeezed hers tighter. It wasn't a painful squeeze, but a firm one. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the stage, but the message was clear. You can do this, the squeeze said. You need to do this, please, the organizer said, his voice sounding desperate now. We don't want to end the night early. Is there truly no one? Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs. It felt like a bird trapped in a cage, flapping wildly. Her breathing became shallow. She told herself to stay seated. She told herself to be the invisible woman she had been for 10 years. But her legs had other ideas. Before her mind could catch up, she felt the muscles in her thighs tense. She felt her body lifting up from the folding chair. The motion was slow, like she was underwater. She stood up. The program slipped from her lap and fluttered to the floor. But she didn't notice. David looked up at her, a mixture of shock and pride on his face. He let go of her hand. A few people sitting near her turned to look. They saw a woman in a dark dress, looking pale and trembling slightly. The organizer's eyes scanned the room, and his gaze locked onto her. He looked hopeful, relieved. Yes, you, ma'am, he said, stepping back from the microphone. Do you play? Alina couldn't speak. If she tried to talk, she might cry. She simply nodded. It was a small, jerky motion of her head.
Wonderful.
The organizer beamed. The tension in the room vanished, replaced by a new wave of anticipation. Come on up. Lena took a step forward. It felt like stepping off a cliff. Her knees were weak, and for a terrifying second, she thought she might fall back down into the safety of her seat. But she didn't. She took another step. She began to walk down the center aisle. With every step, the memories got louder. She heard her mother's voice in her ear, correcting her posture. She heard the sound of the metronome ticking away in their old living room. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the years she had spent ignoring her passion. The aisle seemed to stretch on forever. The ceiling lights felt too bright, exposing her, stripping away the protection of the darkness she had been hiding in. The sound of her heels clicking on the wooden floor sounded like a drum roll, counting down the seconds until she would have to face the music. Both literally and figuratively. She wasn't just walking toward a piano. She was walking toward a past she had buried. She was walking toward the pain she had suppressed for a decade. The air in the hall grew heavy, as if the audience could sense that something significant was happening. They stopped whispering. They stopped moving. All eyes were on the lone figure walking slowly toward the stage. They didn't know her story, but they could feel the gravity in her movements. They could feel the weight she was carrying. And as Alina climbed the 3 wooden steps to the stage, she knew there was no turning back. The shadows were behind her now. The only thing left to do was play. The wooden steps leading up to the stage felt steeper than they looked. It's like climbing a hill in a dream where your legs are heavy and sluggish. With every step Alina took, the air seemed to get thinner, harder to pull into her lungs. The rain tapped harder against the windows, a rhythmic drumming that matched the chaotic beating of her own heart. She could feel hundreds of eyes locked onto her back. Usually, this attention would have made her shrink, would have made her want to disappear into the floorboards, but now she felt strangely detached. She felt like she was watching herself from the ceiling. A separate person observing a woman walking toward a ledge. She reached the stage and walked across the polished floorboards. They didn't creak under her weight, which surprised her. She expected the floor to groan under the burden she was carrying, but it held firm. The grand piano loomed ahead of her, looking massive and imposing. Up close, it was even more intimidating than it had looked from the back of the room. It was a beast of black lacquer and gold trim, reflecting the stage lights in its shiny surface. The lid was propped open, revealing the intricate strings and hammers inside the belly of the instrument. It looked like a ribcage, exposed and waiting. Elena stopped when she reached the bench. It was a simple, padded black bench, worn smooth by years of other musicians sitting there, worrying, hoping, and preparing. She looked down at it. It was just a piece of furniture, but to her it looked like an electric chair. Sitting down meant committing. Sitting down meant opening the door to the room where she kept all her monsters. She stood there for a moment, frozen, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. The silence in the hall was absolute now. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums. The audience was waiting. Some people were shifting in their seats, perhaps wondering why she was just standing there. The organizer stood off to the side, looking slightly anxious, ready to jump in if she changed her mind and bolted. Elena took a deep, shaky breath. She smelled the scent of old wood and the faint metallic smell of the piano strings. The smell hit her like a physical blow to the chest, dragging her back through time. Suddenly, she wasn't in a community hall anymore. She was 10 years old again, in her parents' living room. The sun was streaming through the curtains, dust motes dancing in the light. Her mother was sitting next to her on the piano bench, her hand warm and reassuring on Elena's shoulder. "Posture, Elena," her mother would say gently. "Back straight. You have to let the breath flow." Her mother had been her teacher, her guide, her biggest fan. Music had been the thing that connected them. When words failed, music spoke. But then, the sickness came. The bright sun in the living room was replaced by the harsh, flickering lights of a hospital room. The sound of the piano was replaced by the beeping of monitors and the hushed whispers of doctors. Elena remembered sitting by the bed, holding her mother's thin, papery hand as the machines counted down the final moments. She remembered promising herself that she wouldn't fall apart, that she would be strong. But strength came at a cost. The cost was the music. Every time she looked at the keys after that day, she didn't see art. She saw the emptiness left behind. She saw the hands that would never play again. So, she locked the piano and threw away the key, or at least, she did it in her mind. She closed off that part of her soul because the pain of accessing it was too great. Now, standing in front of this strange piano, Elena felt the walls of that mental prison beginning to crack. She felt the grief pushing against her ribs, trying to get out. She looked out into the audience, but the bright stage lights blinded her. She couldn't see individual faces, no David, no kind strangers. She just saw a dark, shapeless void. That was a mercy. She didn't have to see their judgment. She didn't have to see their pity. She could just pretend she was alone. Slowly, painfully slowly, she lowered herself onto the bench. The wood was hard and cold against her legs. She smoothed the fabric of her dress over her knees, a nervous habit she couldn't break. She sat there, staring at the 88 black and white keys. They looked like a long row of teeth, ready to bite. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in her stomach. What if she couldn't do it? What if her fingers had forgotten? It had been 10 years. Muscles had memory, but they also atrophied. What if she sat down and nothing came out? What if she made a fool of herself? The panic rose in her throat, tasting like bile. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap to stop them. She looked down at her own hands. They looked older than she remembered. There were faint lines on her skin, signs of the life she had lived without the music. These were hands that had washed dishes, folded laundry, and typed emails. They were hands that had held her husband's, but they had forgotten the magic of creating something out of silence. "Just breathe," a voice whispered in her head. It sounded like her mother, but it also sounded like David. It was the voice of reason. Cutting through the noise of her fear, Alina closed her eyes for a second. She let the darkness wrap around her. She pictured the grief not as a heavy stone, but as water. It was rising inside her, filling her up. She had been holding it back for so long, building dams and levees to keep it contained. But you can only hold back the ocean for so long. Eventually, the water breaks through. She opened her eyes and looked at the music rack. There was no sheet music there. The organizer hadn't had time to set anything up. That was fine. She didn't need notes. She didn't need a map. She knew where she was going. She knew the territory by heart. Even if she hadn't walked it in a decade, she hovered her hands over the keys, her right hand trembling slightly in the air. She was inches away from touching the ivory. The distance felt infinite. This was the point of no return. The moment skin touched plastic and ivory, the spell would be cast. There would be no going to the safe silence. The dam would break. The audience was silent. Someone coughed once in the back, a sharp, echoing sound. But then the silence returned. The air in the room was tense, electric with anticipation. They could feel her hesitation. They could sense that this wasn't just a performance. It was a battle. Alina thought about David sitting in the back row. She thought about his hand squeezing hers, the silent encouragement. She thought about the years of quiet dinners and the empty spaces and conversations where music used to be. She realized with a sudden clarity that startled her that she wasn't just doing this for them. She was doing it because she was tired of running. She was tired of being half a person. She was tired of the silence. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the hall. She straightened her back, pulling her shoulders up, just like her mother had taught her all those years ago. The movement was small, but it was significant. It was a soldier taking up a weapon. It was a survivor facing the wreckage. Her right hand descended. It moved slowly, almost in slow motion. The pointer finger extended, reaching for the note. For a split second, time seemed to stop. The rain outside froze in midair. The dust motes stopped dancing. The world held its breath, and then her finger touched the key. It wasn't a strike or a hit. It was a gentle, tentative touch, like someone testing the ice on a frozen lake. As the key went down, the felt hammer inside the piano struck the string. A single sound rang out. A soft, low C. It wasn't a perfect note. It was a little hesitant, a little muddy. But it was real. It cut through the silence of the hall like a knife. The vibration traveled through the piano, into the bench, up her spine, and into her heart. It was a spark in the darkness. It was the first sound of the avalanche. Alina didn't pull her hand away. She left it there, pressing the key down, letting the sound fade into the air, listening to the ghost of the note as it disappeared into the rafters. She was no longer standing on the edge. She had jumped. The single note hung in the air like a fragile thread, shimmering against the silence before it slowly began to fade. It was a quiet sound, barely more than a whisper, but to Alina, it sounded like a shout in a library. For a terrifying second after the note vanished, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She sat frozen, her right hand still poised over the keys, her breath caught in her throat. It felt as though the entire world was waiting for her to either run away or keep going. The audience was so still that she could hear the soft hum of the stage lights, and the rain still beating a relentless rhythm against the high windows. Her left hand, which had been resting limp on her lap, began to move. It felt detached from her body, like it was being pulled by an invisible string. Slowly it rose and found a position on the lower end of the keyboard. Her fingers felt stiff and cold, foreign objects that didn't quite belong to her anymore. They hovered over the white keys, trembling slightly. Then, without a conscious thought, her left hand pressed down. A deep, resonant chord joined the memory of the first note. It was a C minor chord, dark and full of sadness. It wasn't a clean, professional chord. The timing was slightly off, and the pressure wasn't perfectly even, but it was honest. It was the sound of a heavy heart opening up. as the vibration of the cord hummed through the bench and into her legs. Something shifted inside Elena's chest. The tight knot of panic began to loosen, replaced by a different kind of feeling. It was a release. The music acted as a key, turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 10 years. Suddenly, the stiffness in her fingers began to melt away. The years of silence fell behind her, and her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Her right hand began to move again. It didn't strike the keys. It caressed them. She started to play a simple melody, the notes weaving together like a familiar story. It was the opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, a piece she knew intimately. In the past, she had played it with technical precision, focusing on the difficulty of the runs and the power of the dynamics. She had played it to show off, but this time was different. There was no showing off here. She was stumbling through the notes like a walker finding their path in the dark. She missed a note here and there, clumsy slip that would have made her younger self cringe with embarrassment. But tonight, in this dusty hall, the mistakes didn't matter. The audience sat mesmerized. They had expected a performance, maybe something polished or amateurish, but they weren't prepared for this. They weren't hearing music. They were hearing a confession. There was a rawness to the sound that went beyond technical skill. The way she lingered on certain notes, pressing them just a fraction too long, made it sound like she was trying to hold on to a fleeting memory. The way her hands moved, sometimes hesitant, sometimes rushing, felt like the erratic rhythm of a heartbeat. Elena's eyes were fixed on her hands, watching them as if they belonged to a stranger. She saw the scars on her knuckles, the slight tremor in her wrists, and the way her tendons flexed under the skin. These were the hands that had held her mother's hand as the life faded out of it. These were the hands that had folded the last of her mother's clothes into boxes. And now, these hands were doing what they were made to do. She closed her eyes, shutting out the glare of the stage lights. The darkness behind her eyelids was safer. It allowed her to go deeper into the music. She wasn't in the community hall anymore. She was back in that hospital room. She could smell the antiseptic cleaner and the faint scent of lilies from the bouquet on the windowsill. She could hear the slow, rasping breath of her mother. The music began to swell. The simple melody grew more complex, her fingers finding the strength to reach further, to dig deeper into the keys. The sound grew louder, filling the hall. It was no longer a whisper. It was a cry. She struck a low bass note with her left hand, and the piano seemed to groan in response. The sound resonated through the floorboards, vibrating against the soles of her shoes. With the increase in volume, the dam inside her began to crack. For 10 years, Alina had treated her grief like a dangerous animal, keeping it locked in a cage, feeding it silence, afraid that if she let it out, it would consume her. She had built walls around her heart, telling herself that if she didn't feel the pain, it wouldn't hurt. But as her fingers danced over the ivories, she realized the truth. The pain was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting, festering in the dark. The music was dragging it into the light. She hit a series of chords, her hands moving in unison. The sound was rich and full, a wall of sound that washed over the audience. It wasn't beautiful in a traditional sense. It was jagged and rough. It sounded like the audio track of a movie, where the character is finally breaking down. There was no hiding the emotion in the playing. Every hesitation was a sob. Every loud chord was a scream of frustration. A tear rolled down Elena's cheek, hot and fast. She didn't wipe it away. Another one followed, tracing a path through the powder on her face. Her vision blurred, but she didn't need to see the keys. Her fingers knew the way. They were moving on their own now, guided by a muscle memory that was stronger than her fear. The people in the front rows could see her shaking. They could see the tears glistening on her face under the lights. They looked at each other, confused and deeply moved. This wasn't the light entertainment they had signed up for on a rainy Tuesday night. This was a glimpse into a private soul. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsettled by such naked emotion. Others leaned forward, captivated, their own experiences of loss bubbling to the surface as they listened to the woman play. David sat in the back row, his hands gripping his knees. He had wanted her to play, hoping it would bring her some peace. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the sheer force of it. Watching her, he felt like he was seeing his wife for the first time in years. The woman who sat at the piano wasn't the quiet, composed woman he lived with. She was a raw nerve, exposed and electrifying. He realized then that he didn't know the full depth of her pain. He had seen the surface, the sadness, but he hadn't seen the ocean underneath. Watching her play, he felt a mix of pride and heartbreak, a desire to run up on stage and hold her, and a knowledge that he couldn't interrupt this. This was something she had to do alone. The melody shifted, moving into a softer, more intricate passage. Elena's fingers moved lightly now, barely touching the keys. The music became delicate, fragile. It sounded like a memory of a lullaby. It was the way her mother used to play when Elena was a child, gentle and soothing. But as she played, the sweetness of the memory was tainted by the knowledge of loss. The notes trembled, just as her hands trembled. She thought about the silence that had filled her house for the last decade. It had been a safe silence, a protective silence. But as the piano sang, she realized that the silence had also been a suffocation. She had been holding her breath for 10 years, and the music was finally letting her exhale. The transition between the soft melody and the next section was abrupt. A sudden run of notes, cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall, signaled a change. The music was becoming agitated. The rhythm quickened. Her breathing became faster, matching the tempo. She was playing the panic now. She was playing the feeling of the world spinning out of control. The feeling of being powerless to stop the things that hurt. The piano thundered. The sound was big enough to fill the entire hall, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling. It drowned out the sound of the rain. It drowned out the sound of the traffic outside. It drowned out everything except the pounding of her own heart. Elena was no longer sitting on a bench. She was falling into the music. She was letting it pull her down into the deep, dark places where she kept her pain hidden. She was fighting with the keys, striking them harder than she needed to, pouring her anger and her frustration into the instrument. The audience sat in stunned silence. Nobody coughed. Nobody moved. They were all being pulled under by the current of her performance. Even people who knew nothing about classical music could feel the urgency in the room. They could feel that this wasn't just a song. It was a battle. And the woman at the piano was fighting for her life. Elena's fingers were flying now, blurring as they moved across the keys. She didn't care about the mistakes. She didn't care if she hit the wrong notes. All she cared about was the sound, the feeling of the vibration, the release. She was playing the pain she had hidden inside, and it was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing she had ever done. The music was no longer just a melody. It had become a living, breathing entity that filled every corner of the hall. Elena was completely lost in it now. The hesitation that had marked the beginning was gone, replaced by a frantic, driving energy. Her fingers moved across the keys with a speed that surprised even her, flying up and down the keyboard in a blur of motion. The sound was rising, swelling like a tidal wave that was just about to crash. She wasn't thinking about notes or rhythms anymore. She wasn't thinking about the people watching her. She was thinking about the anger. For 10 years, she had told herself that she had to be strong. She had told herself that crying wouldn't bring her mother back, so she just didn't cry. She swallowed the tears, she swallowed the screams, and she pretended that everything was okay. But it wasn't okay. It had never been okay. And now, all that buried emotion was coming out through her hands. The piano was taking a beating. Usually, pianists treat the instrument with a gentle touch, respecting the mechanics of the hammers and strings. But Elena was attacking the piano. She slammed her hands down on the low bass notes, creating a sound that was more like a roar of thunder than a musical note. The vibration shook the bench beneath her. It rattled the floorboards. It felt like she was trying to break the piano, as if she hit the keys hard enough, she could shatter the reality of the last 10 years. Her body swayed violently with the music. She was no longer sitting with the perfect, rigid posture her mother had taught her. She was hunched over the keys, her face contorted in a grimace of pain and effort. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down the side of her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't wipe it away. Her hair was falling loose from its pins, straggling across her face, but she didn't push it back. She was raw. She was messy. she was real. The melody shifted again, moving into a chaotic, tumbling run of notes that sounded like a panic attack. It was the sound of a mind racing, of thoughts spiraling out of control. She remembered the nights right after the funeral, the nights when the silence of the empty house was so loud it hurt her ears. She remembered pacing the floor, wanting to scream, wanting to run, but instead just sitting in the dark and staring at the wall. She was playing that silence now, but filling it with noise. She was giving a voice to the panic she had suppressed for a decade. The audience was mesmerized. But it was an uncomfortable kind of mesmerized. People looked at each other with wide eyes, some with their hands over their mouths. They could feel the intensity radiating off the stage. It was almost painful to watch. It felt intrusive, like walking into a room where someone is crying and not knowing whether to stay or leave. But they couldn't leave. They were frozen by the sheer power of her performance. David sat with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He was watching the woman he loved fall apart in front of 100 strangers, and he realized that he had never seen her truly alive until this moment. The woman he lived with was a placeholder, a shell. The woman at the piano was Elaine, all of her. The good and the bad, the light and the dark. He felt a lump form in his throat, his own eyes stinging with tears. He saw the way her shoulders shook with the effort of playing, the way she poured every ounce of her remaining strength into the music. The sound grew louder, massive, and overwhelming. Alina was playing chords that required both hands, stretching her fingers to their limit to reach the notes. She was playing the anger at the doctors who couldn't help. The anger at a world that kept turning while her world had stopped. The anger at herself for not being able to save her mother. Every strike of the key was an accusation. Every crash of the piano was a shout of why. The lights above her seemed to blaze hotter. The air in the hall felt heavy, charged with electricity. It was as if the storm outside had come inside, trapped within the four walls of the room. The sound of the rain against the windows was completely drowned out now. There was only the piano, a monstrous, beautiful, screaming beast. Elena's fingers were beginning to ache. She hadn't played like this in years. Her muscles were straining, protesting the sudden, violent exertion. But she didn't stop. She welcomed the pain in her hands because it matched the pain in her heart. It felt good to hurt physically. It felt like a release. She wasn't the stoic widow anymore. She wasn't the quiet neighbor. She was a force of nature. She hit a series of dissonant, clashing notes. In a standard performance, these would be mistakes, ugly sounds to be avoided. But here, they were perfect. They were the sound of a heart breaking. They were the sound of things falling apart. The tension in the music was unbearable. It felt like a rubber band being stretched to its snapping point. The audience was leaning forward in their seats, their breath held in their chests, waiting for the release, and then it happened. Elena's hands moved to the highest keys on the piano. She played a fast, intricate trill, a fluttering sound that sounded like a bird trying to fly with a broken wing. It was desperate and fragile. It was the sound of hope struggling to survive in the darkness. It was the sound of her mother's voice telling her it would be okay even when it wasn't. The music began to slow down. The frantic energy started to drain away, leaving a heavy, exhausted sound in its wake. She played a descending run of notes, moving from the high end of the piano down to the middle. The volume dropped drastically. The roar faded to a murmur. The storm was passing, leaving behind a landscape of devastation. Her shoulders slumped forward. The strength that had been holding her up seemed to vanish. She was playing slowly now, each note plucked out of the air like a heavy stone. The melody was sorrowful, a deep, aching grief that was different from the anger of a few moments ago. This was the grief of acceptance. This was the grief of saying goodbye. The audience could feel the shift. The air in the room cooled. The tension broke, replaced by a profound sadness that settled over everyone like a blanket. It was a shared sadness now. Everyone in the hall had lost something. Everyone had a ghost. Alina was playing for all of them. She reached a section where the music called for a pause. A long rest. A moment of total silence. Alina lifted her hands off the keys. For the first time since she sat down, the piano was silent. But the silence wasn't empty. It was vibrating with the echoes of what had just been played. It was a heavy, sacred silence. She sat there, her hands hovering in the air, her chest heaving. She looked down at the keys, her vision blurred by tears. She could see her reflection in the shiny black surface of the piano, a distorted, ghostly image of a woman who looked nothing like the composed person who had walked onto the stage. She looked wrecked. She looked broken. But for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding. The pause lasted for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one coughed. No one checked their watch. They were all waiting for her to finish the story. They knew there was one last thing to say. Alina took a deep, ragged breath. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely steady them. But she knew where they needed to go. She had to finish it. She had to play the final chord. Slowly, painfully, she lowered her hands back to the keyboard. Her left hand found a deep bass note, holding it down. Her right hand found the chord that would resolve everything. It was a major chord, but it was played softly, without celebration. It was a chord of closure. She didn't strike it hard. She pressed into the keys, sinking her weight into them, letting the sound bloom slowly. It was a final, exhaled breath. As the sound rang out, Alina closed her eyes. She didn't pull her hands away immediately. She let the chord sustain, holding on to the last note as if it were a lifeline. The vibration hummed against her fingertips, traveling up her arms and into her heart, sealing the cracks that had opened up. It was done. The final chord didn't just end. It dissolved into the air, fading slowly like the last light of a sunset. Usually when a performance finishes, there is a moment of quiet before the applause begins. But this time, the silence that filled the community hall was different. It was heavy, thick, and almost sacred. No one moved. No one clapped. The people in the audience sat frozen in their seats, their hands resting idly in their laps. Completely stunned by what they had just witnessed, Alina sat at the piano, her hands still resting heavily on the keys. She didn't lift them. She kept pressing them down, as if she was afraid that if she let go, the connection to her mother would sever again. She kept her eyes closed, her head bowed low. Her chest heaved with deep, ragged breaths, trying to find oxygen in a room that felt drained of it. She was exhausted in a way she had never been before, just physically tired in her muscles, but empty, hollowed out in the deepest part of her soul. She had poured everything she had into the instrument, leaving nothing behind. For 10 years she had been a container for grief, holding it inside to keep from making a mess. But now, the mess was all over the piano keys, scattered across the stage in the form of raw sound. And for the first time in a decade, she felt light. The crushing weight on her shoulders was gone. It had been terrifying to let it out, but the relief was undeniable. The monster she had been afraid of wasn't a monster at all. It was just sadness, and once it was allowed to breathe, it didn't feel quite so deadly. From the back of the room, David stood up. He didn't rush forward. He didn't shout. He just stood there, looking at his wife with tears streaming down his face. He saw a woman he hadn't seen in 10 years. He saw the woman he fell in love with, the woman who felt things deeply and wasn't afraid to show it. He realized that he had been living with a ghost for a long time, but the person sitting on that bench was alive. More alive than she had been since the funeral. Slowly, others began to stand up. First, one person in the third row, then an older couple near the front. They didn't stand to cheer. They stood out of respect. They stood because they knew they had just shared something incredibly private. A man in the front row who had been checking his watch nervously when Alina first walked on stage was now weeping openly, without shame. The music had reached past his boredom and touched his own buried losses. Alina opened her eyes. The stage lights were still bright, but they didn't hurt her anymore. She looked down at her hands, pale and trembling against the black and white keys. They looked different to her now. They weren't just hands that did chores and signed checks. They were instruments. They were capable of translating pain into something beautiful. She lifted her hands from the keys. As soon as the pressure was released, the silence of the room rushed back in, but it was a gentle silence now. It was a silence that offered comfort, not judgment. She turned her head slightly and looked out into the audience. Her vision was blurry from tears, but she could see the shapes of people standing. She couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could feel the energy coming from them. It wasn't the harsh energy of curiosity she had feared when she walked down the aisle. It was a soft, enveloping wave of empathy. They weren't judging her mistakes. They weren't thinking about her messy hair or her tear-stained face. They were with her. They were in the palm of her hand, not because she was a perfect musician, but because she was a human being who had dared to be vulnerable, the organizer of the event, who had been standing nervously in the wings, finally walked onto the stage. He started to approach the microphone to say something, but then he stopped. He looked at Alina, saw her fragile state, and thought better of it. He simply nodded to her, a small, genuine gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped back into the shadows. He knew that words were unnecessary. Anything he said would only break the spell. Alina pushed herself up from the bench. Her legs felt weak, like jelly, as if she had just run a marathon. For a second, she thought she might stumble, and a fresh wave of panic washed over her. But she steadied herself, gripping the edge of the piano lid for support. She straightened her back, wiping her face with the sleeve of her dress. She wasn't trying to hide the tears anymore. She wore them like a badge of honor. She turned to face the audience fully. At that moment, a sound finally broke the silence. It wasn't applause. It was a single person clapping, slow, rhythmic claps coming from the back. It was David. He wasn't clapping to celebrate a show. He was clapping to welcome her back. It was the sound of one soul reaching out to another. His clapping was like a trigger. Suddenly, the room erupted. But it wasn't the polite, distant applause from the beginning of the night. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound that crashed over the stage, filled with emotion and appreciation. People didn't just clap with their hands. Some stomped their feet. Others shouted bravo. The sound was deafening. It's a stark contrast to the quiet misery Alina had lived in for so long. Alina stood there, taking it in. She didn't bow like a performer. She didn't wave like a celebrity. She just stood there, a small, humble smile touching her lips for the first time in years. She looked down at David again. He was clapping harder than anyone, his eyes locked on hers, smiling through his own tears. She knew that she would cry again later, probably as soon as she got to the car. She knew that the sadness wasn't gone forever. Grief doesn't just vanish. But she also knew that she didn't have to be afraid of it anymore. She had faced it, looked it in the eye, played it until it surrendered. She gave a small, cold nod to the room, a silent thank you, and then turned to walk off the stage. The walk back across the wooden floorboards was different from the walk to the piano. Then, she had been walking to her execution. Now she was walking toward her life. The steps felt lighter. The darkness in her peripheral vision had retreated. As she stepped off the stage and into the wings, the cool air of the backstage area hit her face. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes, listening to the applause still echoing in the hall. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. A moment later, David was there. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't say good job. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her. It was a tight, fierce hug. It's the kind that two people give when they realize how close they came to losing each other to the silence. Alina buried her face in his shoulder and let out a long, shuddering breath. She felt safe. "You played," he whispered into her hair. "You really played." "I did," she whispered back, her voice hoarse and raw. She looked back toward the stage, where the piano sat silent and gleaming under the lights. It didn't look like a monster anymore. It looked like a friend. It looked like a place where she could go when things got too hard, a place where she could put the things she couldn't say. Alina took David's hand. Her hand was still shaking, but his grip was steady. "Let's go home," she said. They walked toward the exit, leaving the noise of the crowd behind. As they pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the rainy night, the cold air felt refreshing instead of chilling. The rain was still falling, tapping against the pavement, but it didn't sound lonely anymore. To Alina, it sounded like music. It sounded like the beginning of a new song, one that she was finally ready to play. She squeezed David's hand and stepped into the puddles. It's no longer hiding in the shadows, walking for the first time in 10 years toward the light.